Because this book starts with all the characters going off in different directions, unlike most of the Russells, it is written in multiple points of view. It has 5 main points of view and 2 small ones, including one from the point of view of a bird. So you can look forward to that. I found it a very interesting writing technique, because normally I write the Russells from a first-person point of view. She narrates her memoirs, and although in one of the books, in Locked Rooms, there were bits and pieces of it that followed Holmes instead, most of the books are strictly Russell talking about her life. However, that clearly is not going to work when you have half the characters in the book scattered to the winds. And so this is a multiple viewpoint story. Which always raises the question of where you start reading. I posted on Facebook asking for suggestions. The suggestions that came on, I'd have to explain it for 20 minutes, so we're not going to do that. I could start at the beginning, but which beginning? You have 5 beginnings, so. The wind was not as powerful as it had been the day before crossing from Thurso, but it rose with the sun, and the seas rose with it. By full light, all the fittings in the Fifey's cabin were rattling wildly, and although Damien's arm was bound to his side, half an hour out of Orkney, the toss and fret of the 50-foot-long boat was making him hiss with pain. When the heap of blankets and spare clothing keeping him warm was pulled away, the dressings showed scarlet. Sherlock Holmes rearranged the insulation around his son and tossed another scoop of coal onto the stove before climbing the open companionway to the deck. The young captain looked as if he was clinging to the wheel as much as he was controlling it. Holmes raised his voice against the wind. "Mr. Gordon, is there nothing we can do to calm the boat?" The young man took his eyes from the sails long enough to confirm the unexpected note of concern in the older man's voice, then studied the waves and the rigging overhead. "Only thing we can do is change course. To sail with the wind, you see." Holmes saw. Coming out of Scapa Flow, they had aimed for Strathy, further west across the coast of northern Scotland. In truth, any village but Thurso would do, as long as it had some kind of medical facility. But going west meant battling wind and sea, even unladen. The boat had waves breaking across her bow. "Very good," he said. "Change course." "Thurso, good." Gordon sounded relieved. "No, Wick. A fishing town, big enough to have a doctor, perhaps even a rudimentary hospital. Police too, of course, but warrants or not, what village constable would take note of one fishing boat in a harbour full of them?" "Wick? Oh, but I don't know anyone there. My cousin in Strathy. The lad will be dead by Strathy." "Wick's farther," but calmer. Gordon thought for a moment, then nodded. "Take that line. Be ready when I say." And then to rejoin Russell. The cart slowed and stopped. I wrapped my arms more securely around the child, placing my finger across her lips. The farmer's boots crunched to the road, the cart jerking as his weight left it. I followed the sound of his footsteps, braced for sudden flight, but the steps continued away from us a few feet, paused, then returned, moving more slowly and with a hitch in their gait. A figure suddenly loomed at the back of the cart, and another canister of milk swung inside. He added a second, then climbed back onto his seat and chirruped the horse into motion. He repeated the milk pickup half a mile down the road. Once we were moving, I worked my way towards the back to ease the heavy canisters to one side. The road was smoother here, which meant that our sudden exit would be difficult to conceal. I waited for a rough patch, but before one came, I caught the faint odor of distillery and knew we had run out of time. I gathered the child in my arms and more or less rolled off the back to the road. The horse reacted, but by the time the startled driver had controlled the animal and reined it to a halt, Estelle and I were squatting behind a wall. The man would have seen us had he got down and walked back, but to him the jerk of the cart must have felt like a result of the horse's shy, not the cause of it. After a moment I heard him repeat the noise between his teeth, and the music of milk cans retreated down the road. I rose to get my bearings and found that we were a scarce half-mile from where Captain Javits had set us down. "Can you walk for a bit, Estelle? We're nearly there." In answer, she slipped her hand into mine, and we set off up the road. It took 2 tries to find the correct lane, but to my relief, the plain was there, in a long field surrounded by walls and a hedgerow. Lights shone from the adjoining house, and I led my charge in that direction. I stopped outside the gate to tell the child, "My friend Captain Javits, who drives the airplane, may be there. There's also a nice lady and her son, but we don't want to talk to them too much. We'll only be here for a few minutes." "And then we'll go in the airplane, into the air?" "That's right," I said, adding under my breath, "God help us." I knocked on the door. It opened, to a man pointing a gun at my heart. And you'll have to read the rest yourself. No cliffhangers here. But it's it's interesting to do a book in a series that introduces a whole new side of your characters. And in the last book, I introduced a young man whom they had met once in the past, although the reader had never met him. Damien Adler, who is the son of Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler. He is an artist, a surrealist artist, and a man with many problems. So, the language of bees opened up a lot of interesting psychological landscape for Sherlock Holmes, and it's funny to think of Holmes as having a psychological approach, because we tend to think of Holmes as being a thinking machine and someone who really doesn't have an emotional life. But one of the things that came to me as I was writing the early books in this series, The Beekeeper's Apprentice and so on, was that Arthur Conan Doyle had finished with Sherlock Holmes on the very eve of the Great War, so that his latest setting for one of his stories was The Last Bough, which takes place at the very, very beginning of the Great War. And the stories that were written after that all were set before that time. So that clearly Conan Doyle was of the opinion that Holmes didn't have a place in the England that existed after the Great War. Huge social changes. I mean, we think that our country went through changes in Vietnam. It was nothing compared with what happened to Britain between 1914 and 1919. I mean, not only the sheer number of people who died, but the fact that, for example, one of the books that it was published every year with the aristocracy and talking about who had been born, sort of the blue book for aristocracy, was not published for 2 years in a row because so many young aristocrats were dying. They had no way of keeping it up to date. When they came out of the war, inheritance laws were upside down. Women had run the country, basically, for 4 years. Everything from delivering beer to acting as constables. So that the women's movement, which before the war had been fighting a very, very difficult uphill battle for women's suffrage, after the war, the men looked at each other and said, honestly, there's no way we can say women can't have the vote.